So let's do a quick recap of today's trial testimony in the Derek Chauvin trial for the murder of George Floyd. And let's see where we are on the road to justice. Justice for George Floyd, justice for his family, justice for the Minneapolis community. Because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So let's do a quick recap of the two trial witnesses we saw today in the Derek Chauvin trial for the murder of George Floyd. We saw the treating emergency room doctor and we saw the chief of police, Chief Arredondo. Let's start with the doc. So Dr. Langerfeld was the emergency room doctor who tried to revive George Floyd. He was essentially dead on arrival, and there was no reviving him. And one of the most important pieces of testimony that the ER doc gave was he said that in his view, the leading cause of death was cardiac arrest. His heart stopped due to oxygen deficiency, which he said otherwise translates to asphyxiation. He said that was sort of the leading cause in his estimation. Some might say, well, that sounded a little wishy-washy, right? Not really. Here's why. Emergency room doctors are not in the business of determining cause and manner of death. They have one mission. When a patient presents at the ER, they try to save their lives, right? But they do not thereafter, once they lose a patient, they don't thereafter launch into their own investigation to determine the precise cause and manner of death. Let me give you an example. If somebody comes into the ER with a gunshot wound, frankly, that gunshot wound could be the product of, if the patient dies, that gunshot wound could be a product of homicide, could be a product of suicide, could be a product of an accidental discharge. None of that matters to the emergency room physician who's simply trying to treat a gunshot wound and save the patient's life. So when it comes to the precise cause and manner of death determinations, that's why we have forensic pathologists, medical examiners who perform autopsies and also perform lots of tests, or at least take samples from the decedent at the time of autopsy, tissue samples, organ samples, body fluid samples. They send all those out for further testing, including toxicology testing. And it's only when they get all that information back that medical examiners, forensic pathologists, can reach a definitive conclusion about cause and manner of death. So it may have sounded a little tentative when Dr. Langerfeld said, well, kind of the leading cause of death that I saw was oxygen deficiency or asphyxia, because that's not what ER docs do. I can tell you, in the more than 50 murder trials I prosecuted, and I handled hundreds of other murder cases on top of those, I rarely called an emergency room doctor. I invariably called a medical examiner, a forensic pathologist, the person who performed the autopsy, and sometimes I supplemented that doctor's testimony with other forensic pathologists who had a specific expertise in the kind of death that I was trying to prove up at trial. But I thought Dr. Langerfeld was a good, solid witness. Let's move on to the chief of police, Chief Arredondo, because this is what a chief of police should be. This is what a police officer should be. I hope you got to see at least some of his testimony. He was strong, he was sober, he was circumspect, he was thoughtful, he was precise, and he was definitive. He said Derek Chauvin violated police Department procedures and policies in not one, not two, not three, but 4 ways, based on his review of all of the video footage that was available documenting the end of George Floyd's life. First of all, he said, we have a policy, a hard and fast rule, in our custody, in our care. Once George Floyd was in Derek Chauvin's custody and the custody of those other police officers, he was in their care. They had a duty of care to him, and they violated that duty flagrantly, fatally. He said that Derek Chauvin absolutely did not follow police department procedures on de-escalation, ratcheting down the force used against George Floyd. He violated the department's de-escalation policy. He said the force that Derek Chauvin used on George Floyd was absolutely not reasonable, violated the police department policy on the use of reasonable force. The force he used was excessive. He said, although under some circumstances you are allowed to temporarily use neck restraint, if you use neck restraint, it is only light to moderate neck restraint. And in a powerful answer that he gave to the jury, he said, in no way, shape, or form was Derek Chauvin's neck restraint on George Floyd light to moderate. Therefore, that's another way Derek Chauvin violated Minneapolis Police Department policy. And then finally, he said, and Derek Chauvin and those other officers failed to give aid. And there's a police department policy that you must give aid to a citizen, to an arrestee, to a detainee that's in your care if they're experiencing medical distress. And George Floyd was. Not only did they not give him aid, they killed him. And Chief Arredondo sort of summed up by saying that Derek Chauvin's conduct violated policy, it violated training, it violated values, and it violated the ethics of the Minneapolis Police Department. It was strong testimony, and it was so important because members of the jury who have seen that horrific end-of-life video for themselves and have probably already reached the conclusion that was wrong, that was excessive, that was murder, they might still think to themselves, but I'm not a police officer, I don't know that much about police use of force policies, and policing can be ugly, and sometimes even when police are doing the right thing, it's ugly, because there are people who are hell-bent on hurting the police, and police can use force up to and including deadly force if it's necessary to repel a deadly attack or protect the lives of others. That's not what this was. But jurors might say, I'd like to know more about police department excessive force policies, and now they know more from a really impressive chief of police in Chief Arredondo. I was impressed. I was moved. I was inspired by the chief's testimony, and I have to believe those jurors were as well. There is only one battle left to be fought in my estimation, and it is the cause of death battle, the battle of the expert witnesses, prosecution forensic pathologist versus defense forensic pathologist, and we will be talking more about that as the trial unfolds and as the medical examiners begin to testify. But I will say, as of right now, the prosecution's case is strong, is righteous. It's undeniable. And hopefully it will result in justice for George Floyd, for his family, for the Minneapolis community, and for our country. Because justice matters. As always, folks, please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.